It was great.
Reed's really good at math. You should have did that. Maybe I can talk him into that next week. See, that's just loves music. I mean,
All right, y'all go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 13 this morning. We're going to be looking at that. My lesson's going to load up here. So, any of y'all got like family drama,
Like with us or just our family?
just in general?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we all have that to some extent or another.
Not
Not the two of you, right? But I think we all deal with that to one extent or another. And the good news is the Bible tells us that we're not alone. We're looking at, as we look at Abraham's life today, we're going to see him dealing with some family drama of his own. Okay, and that's, I think that it's helpful for us in a couple of ways. It's helpful for us in the sense that we can see that, we're not alone, especially as we get here toward Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of that, when those things kind of tend to bubble up to the top. But there's more to this story than just family drama. What we're going to see with Abraham today as we look at this story is that he's going to overcome that through a few things that he did. But ultimately what this is again pointing us to, as every story in the life of Abraham does, is pointing us to the gospel. It's pointing us to these promises that God has made to people through people all over the world, through Abraham, that he's going to make this great nation of him, and through this great nation, we're going to see the Messiah come, and so the blessings are going to be for the entire world. But so what we can do as we look in these stories of Abraham is we can do two things. Number one, we can see some lessons for living, and those are not unimportant. Okay, but they're not the primary thing that we look at when we see this. When we study the life of Abraham, the primary thing that we're looking at is the gospel. That's what we're constantly need to see, that we're being pointed toward these promises that God has made through Abraham and to us. And so again, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 13 this morning. And if somebody will read, let's read the verse. Let's read verses 1 through 13. Real quick. Somebody read that for me.
1 through 13.
Uh-huh.
So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who was with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord.
Okay, so let me just kind of lay out some brief background on this story before we move into the truths that I want us to see from it. Okay, so remember where we've come since the beginning of Abraham's life here. Abraham has been called out of his home nation, and he's been called to this land that God has promised to him. If you remember back in chapter 12, God says, go to the land that I've promised you, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and all the families, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed through you. you. And so we see Abraham moving in obedience to follow God here. And we talked about obedience just a couple of weeks ago. But then last week, when we look a little further, we see Abraham fall into disobedience. Instead of going to the land that God promised him, we see Abraham going down to Egypt. There's a drought in the land, and so he goes to Egypt. And then when he gets to Egypt, do y'all remember what he did? Do y'all remember the big wrong he did while he was in Egypt?
Told his wife back like his sister.
Yeah, he lied. He lied. Told his wife to lie about who she was. He's like, "You're really beautiful." And I always thought that was really, really interesting, because like Sarah was like 70 years old at this time, and it's like, "You're so beautiful that they're going to want to get you. They're going to want to take you." If I don't like, that's pretty impressive. If you're 70 and like you're still like that's how Crystal's going to be. But anyway, if you're still going to be that way, okay? So, but anyway, so it says, pretend to be my sister because they'll kill me if they think that you're my wife. And so that's what happens. They say, this is my sister. And so Pharaoh takes her into his house, and y'all remember what happened? Like all kinds of trouble happens to Pharaoh. Like it's like the plague suddenly have hit Pharaoh, and so Abraham has to admit, this is what I did, and he's like, get out of here. And so he gets kicked out of Egypt. All right, and so in his being kicked out of Egypt, it sends him back to the promised land. And so what we see in Abraham here is him going back to obedience, basically. He's moving back towards obedience in his life right here. So I want you to imagine the journey they've taken. And I don't know if I can really do this justice, but they've gone from which is basically modern day Iraq, Babylon, what we know of in the Bible. They take this journey that is a couple of thousand miles. They go north, they come back south, down into the promised land, stay there for a little while, follow further down into Egypt, and now they've come back to the edge of the promised land, which is about right here. So if you imagine Israel, it's kind of along the borders of the Jordan River. The Jordan River's here. You've got the Great Sea here, Sea of Gethsemane, and then you've got the Dead Sea down here. Okay, and so they're down around the Dead Sea in that area. See, they call it Negeb is where they are, which is the southernmost part of the Promised Land. So they've kind of come back to the edge of the Promised Land at this point. Okay, and so we see a few things about Abraham here. We notice something in verse 2. What does it say about who Abraham is and what Abraham's lifestyle, I guess, is like? Yeah, it says he's very rich. He has lots of livestock, lots of silver, and lots of gold. Now, that's great as far as it goes, but there's a little problem with where he is in Negeb. Negeb is a desert. They're right on the northern part of Negeb. You've got a little rain, but we're talking about maybe 8 inches of rain a year. So there's not much rain that happens in that area. And so he's got all these livestock and all these servants and all these people who are with him, and also his nephew Lot has a bunch of people too. So they've got these big groups of both livestock and people. And so what problem does that present in a desert?
Not a lot of food. Scarcity.
Yeah, scarcity. There's not a lot of food. There's not a lot of water. There's not enough land for the livestock. And what does this passage tell us begins to happen between Abraham's people and Lot's people?
And strife.
Yeah, there's strife between them, which is a biblical way of saying drama. Okay, so they've got some drama between them about what is happening there, and so they've got to figure something out. These are close relatives, Lot and Abram. They've been together for years now, but they have to figure something out because they've got all kinds of strife and they can't dwell together. And to add and make it harder, there were other people in the land too. So you've got this large group of people here, plus these other people, we're told, the Canaanites and the Perizzites that are dwelling in the land also. So what is Abraham's solution to all of this, or Abram's solution? Starting in verse 8.
Split up.
Yeah, we're going to have to split up, guys. And so I want you to notice what Abram does right here. What does he tell Lot? Beginning in verse 9.
Is not the whole land before you.
Yeah, it's not the whole land before you. And so, what should you do? What does he tell Lot to do?
Work on me.
Say it again.
Work on me.
Yeah, depart coming, and he says, Lot, choose where you want to go. You go to the east, I'll go to the west. You go to the west, I'll go to the east. You go to the north, I'll go to the south. We're going to split up. But he gives Lot first option, basically. Says go wherever you want to. And so we're told that that Lot looks over the Jordan Valley. So the Jordan Valley is this river just to the it's just to the east of where they are. And he looks over in the river valley there, and he sees that there's that it's lush compared to a desert, especially. Sees that there's lots of space for them to do what they need to do, and so he says, okay, we're going to go here. But you're going to notice, what do we learn about that area also, in addition to it being nice and fertile? What cities are there? Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so this is what they call foreshadowing in the movie. So just be ready for that. Okay, hang on to that. Lot is going to the area around Sodom and Gomorrah at this point. And what do we know about Sodom and Gomorrah? Yeah, sinful. And we're told that at the very end. So they're great sinners in Sodom. What eventually happens to these two cities? Yeah, they're destroyed, and they'll be destroyed because of their sin eventually. We'll get there eventually, but I just want you to see, this is Lot decides that I'm going to cast my, no pun intended, lot with those people. Okay, I'm going to go there, and I'm going to go that way. And so, what does Abram do here? Lot goes to the east, so Abram does what? Yeah, he goes to the west. Look at verse 12. It says he settled in the land of Canaan. So he goes, where he ends up going is to an area just kind of northwest of the Jordan River Valley. He settles there, and that's where he's going to end up staying. Okay? Now, I want you to think about who Abram is at this point. We're told that he's rich. He's got lots of livestock. He's got lots of silver and gold. Lot is his nephew, so in some sense he is subordinate to Abram. Abram is the patriarch of this clan, and so in a lot of different ways, Lot kind of should have, especially in this society, should have kind of all the power here. Basically, he could tell Lot what to do, but what does he do instead? He gives him the choice. He gives him the first choice. What do you think that required of Abram to be able to be willing to give that choice in hopes of resolving the conflict that was going on with him? What did that require of Abram? Maturity, yeah, absolutely. Of course, he's knocking on 80 by now, so he ought to have a little bit. What else?
Humility and generosity.
Yeah, humility and generosity. I think that's absolutely right too. So I say that to say this: if you are going to be able to overcome like family strife, but strife in general, any kind of conflict in any of your lives is going to require humility from at least one of you, and hopefully all of you involved. Okay. And humility is hard, because the reason we have conflict is because we think we're right, right? We think we're the ones who are right and they're the ones who are wrong, and so so why would we be humble about that? And so Abram does exactly the opposite here. He says, I'm going to, I could very well say, I'm going to take this land and then you take what's left. But he says instead, you take the land and I'll take what's left. That required great humility from a person who didn't have to show humility right there. And generosity is the other thing. This idea of the land was his. God had given it to him. God had promised it to him. He could take whatever he wanted to. And instead of saying, okay, it's mine, so I'm going to get the best part, he instead says, no, I'm going to let you, Lot, take the part that you think is best. Okay. And so there's great humility shown here, and I think that's one of the real keys to overcoming conflict. People who are willing to humble themselves, not just before the other person, but before God. Okay. So I can imagine that having God speak to you would probably humble you. You know, and so Abram is remembering God speaking to him all those years ago, and it has humbled him. So I saw this great video, and I say great. I don't know if it's, I'm probably, the source is not great, but it's this great video on The Onion last week. Do y'all know The Onion? Y'all know what that is? You know, it's a satire. Y'all never get my pop culture references. I need y'all to, okay. It's a great video on The Onion. The Onion is a satire news website, okay? So it's like fake news before, you know, Donald Trump invented the term or whatever. But it's like, so this guy says, I have this great honor today, it's a video, it says a great honor of interviewing the Almighty God today. I've landed an exclusive interview with God. And so they do this big intro, and it looks like this news package type thing. And then he sits down and he's like, God, thank you so much for, like God all of a sudden shows up and it terrifies him. You know, I thought this is the most theologically accurate thing I've ever seen on The Onion. You have to go back and look at it, but he's like screaming, I'm sorry, and thank you, and now I understand, and God is just like booming on him, you know, and it breaks the camera, and anyway, it's a perfect video explaining what an actual encounter with God would be like. And so Abram has had this encounter with God, okay? He has had an encounter with God, and it has humbled him. And so because Abram's had this encounter with God, that has humbled him, then he is able now to go to Lot and say, you know something, you do what you think is best. I'll give you first choice, first option right here. And so if you're struggling with humility, this is the place to go. It's to remind yourself of what God has done for you in Christ, remind you of who you were before and who you are now, and what God has done in the meantime, okay? To remind yourself of who you would be if you had to stand before God outside of Jesus, outside of having relationship with Jesus. You would be destroyed by him, okay? And so Abram has had an encounter with God, and it has led to this place of humility that he is now able to overcome this conflict. I think there's something else that's worth noting here. Abram has now moved from this place of disobedience into a place of obedience. And I think we're tempted sometimes to think that because we're now doing the right thing, we're now obeying God, that everything's going to be all right. You know, I was messing up before, and I knew I was messing up before, but now I'm doing right, and so I expect everything to go right for me. That's not what happens with Abram here, okay? As a matter of fact, the moving back into obedience to God leads to the conflict. All right, so the reason, why did he leave the promised land to go to Egypt in the first place? Y'all remember?
Famine.
Yeah, there was a famine in the land. So he was looking for something, they were looking for food, okay? But he left the land God promised him. Now he has come back to the land, and we don't know if the famine's going on, but it's still the same problem he had before. So another lesson right there probably is leaving behind your problems doesn't make them go away. They're going to come back to you at some point, okay? So he's here, he's now in obedience, but the conflict has not gone away. So doing the right thing does not mean that everything's going to go okay, but we're called to do the right thing anyway. And so he's calling us to obedience right here, okay? And so now, if the lesson today was do the right thing, but it's going to stink, that wouldn't be that great a lesson, okay? So, though it might at times, but I think as we see this story here progress, we're going to see a much better ending to the lesson that will help us, okay? So, anybody want to add anything on that, or anybody have any questions on that passage before we move on? Okay, somebody read verses 14 through 18 for me then.
The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk around through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, which he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord.
Okay, so a lot to see here, but we see Lot has separated from Abram, and now we see God appear to Abram again. So he appeared to him a few years ago, but it's been some time since his last appearance. As far as we know, God didn't speak to him again in a way that wasn't recorded, so we assume that this is the next time God has appeared to him. A lot has happened between these two appearances of God. So God speaks to him when he's all the way back near Babylon, okay, near Ur, speaks to him and says, you go now. And as far as we know, Abraham hasn't heard audibly from God since then. And so I want you to think about what's happened since then. They traveled thousands of miles. He's gone into Egypt and followed God and not followed God, gone into disobedience there. He's lied about who his wife is. He got kicked out of Egypt. Now he's back in the promised land. He's had conflict with Lot. And he hasn't heard God's voice since that moment that he called him to go to the promised land. So what do you think some of the concerns that he might have are since he has not heard God's voice since then? Where might you be? If like you had this certain word from God, but then you didn't feel like you heard from him again for years, and then you'd fallen into sin. What might you be thinking in that situation?
Has he abandoned me?
Yeah, has he abandoned me? Absolutely. Has God abandoned me? Is he here? Is he here anymore? What about those promises that God made to Abraham? What do you think he might be wondering about those promises now?
They still hold up.
Yeah, do they still hold up? I've done some really dumb stuff over the last couple of years. Are those promises still there? And so at this moment is when God decides that, okay, I'm going to appear again, I'm going to speak to Abram. And what does he tell him? I'm beginning in verse 14. Somebody can just read it. What does God say there?
Look around from where you are to the north and south and east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever.
Okay, so God has called him here. The last time God spoke to him, he wasn't in the promised land. He came to the promised land, but then he left the promised land, and now he's back, and he's settled into this place of obedience now, and God says, look around. What I promised you, here you are. Look around to your north and your south and your east and your west and see what what I have for you, okay? All of this land is going to be yours, and not just yours, but your offspring, and for how long? Forever, okay? And then what does he say in verse 16?
I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth.
I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth. Do y'all remember what he told him last time his offspring would be like?
Stars in the sky.
The stars in the sky, okay? And so before he's called it like the dust of the earth, now he's comparing it to the stars in the sky. I don't know if there's more dust than stars or not, but both of them are a bunch, okay? That's what he's getting at here. Your offspring are going to be more than can actually be counted. Now that's interesting because how many offspring does Abram currently have? None. Zero. And he's old, okay? Like I know y'all think I'm old, but Abram is really old here, okay? He's knocking on 80 at this point, okay? And so he has no offspring at this point, and God is telling him, those promises that I give you, they still stand. And so when you notice in verse 17, he gives him another command. What is the command that he gives him?
Go walk through the land.
Yeah, go walk through the land, walk the length and the breadth of the land, and I'll give it to you. And so that's exactly what Abram did. It says that he moved his tent, came and settled to the oaks of Mamre. I don't know if that's how that's pronounced. Remember what we say when we read the Bible. When you get to words, just read them with confidence, and nobody will know any better, okay? So he came there, and then he gets there at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. You'll remember the last time that God spoke to Abraham. He moved into the promised land, and the last thing he did, we're told, was he built an altar to the Lord. So we're going back to worship here. He's reminding us that Abram, the point of all of this was worship, okay? Now, what is the point of this promise that God is making to Abram about his offspring being as the dust of the earth? What is he telling him about giving him the land? What are the ultimate promises here? Who do those offspring become? Who are Abram's offspring that live in this land, the promised land? It's not a trick question. This becomes the nation of Israel, okay? Now you're all like, I should have said that. This is Abram's offspring become the nation of Israel. So remember what's going to happen. Abram's going to have a son. His son's going to have a son. They're going to have 12 sons, and then they're going to go down to Egypt, and we're going to see, you see all that stuff. They go down to Egypt. They become slaves in Egypt, and then Moses comes. Moses takes them out of Egypt through the Exodus, and they're brought into the Promised Land, and they become the nation of Israel. What is important about the nation of Israel for us? Who comes through the nation of Israel? Jesus, okay? So these promises that are being made to Abram are not just promises for Abram, okay? So when he says, back in chapter 12, when he says, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through you, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed to you, this is a promise that Jesus is coming, and he's going to fix and he's going to restore everything. And so when Abram doesn't know all this at this point, all he knows is that God's promised him this land, and he says he's going to make a nation out of him. But ultimately what God is doing is he's showing his grace to Abram as an example for us. Because what has Abram really done at this point? What had he just done? I mean, think about what he just done. He just gone to Egypt. He just fallen into sin. He just did what he shouldn't have done and what he knew he shouldn't have done. And so there may be a fear here to God's promises. As you said, to God's promises still stand. He's saying yes, but not by an act of anything else than my grace. And the same is true for us, okay? The promises of Abraham are counted to us, but counted to us through God's grace. You get the benefit of Abraham's promises through God's grace also. And after God makes this promise, he gives a command, and that command is now go into the land. And so I want you to see, this is really important. We talk about this a lot, but it's really easy to get this out of whack. God's command is not so that Abram will receive the promises. God's command is because Abram has received the promises. So the same way with us. We don't obey so that we will be right with God. We obey because we've been made right with God. Okay? Big difference. If you get that out of order, you become a legalist and you fall into a trap of believing that you can somehow earn God's favor, and that's not what's happening here. Abram didn't get called out of Ur because he was this great guy who was better than everybody else. God chose him by an act of his grace. And in the same way he chooses us by an act of his grace, he gives us salvation by an act of his grace. And then we can obey. And only then can we obey. We talked about that. Even when we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, which talks so much about obedience and talks so much about what we're supposed to do. But it's always in reaction to what God has already done. And if we get that out of order, we get the whole gospel out of order. And we've fallen into the same trap that so many other people fall into. Every other religion falls into this idea that I have to earn God's favor. Abram did not earn God's favor. God showed Abram his favor, and therefore Abram obeyed God in this situation. That's the same thing that we're called to also. And so, and then this leads to the ultimate point, okay? And again, look at verse 18. What does Abram do here when he gets to Hebron? What's the last thing we're told?
Built an altar.
He built an altar to the Lord. What do you do at an altar to the Lord? What's the purpose of an altar? Again, not a trick question. Worship, yeah. That's the purpose of the altar was worship. So again, we saw that back in chapter 12. The same thing happened. He travels into the Promised Land and he builds an altar. The point is to worship the God who has given him these promises by an act of his grace to not only work for him but to worship him. And so what I need you to understand is the point of everything is worship. Okay? That's the point of everything that God does for us. God calls us to worship him because he is worthy of our worship and because he created us for worship. Okay? And when we are worshiping God, we are fulfilling what we were created to do. And so the same thing here with Abram. He is back in God's will. He's being obedient, and now he can truly worship God. And so obedience and worship are really connected. It's hard to truly worship God if you're not obeying God, okay? And then in the same sense, obedience is an act of worship, because we're called to do everything for the glory of God as an act of worship. And so obedience then becomes an act of worship. And so both of those are true. And so we see that here in the life of Abram, okay? All right, anybody have anything they want to add? We got questions, anything like that? They're awfully chatty this morning. I told y'all I'm going to break y'all eventually. So, all right. Well, if we don't have anything else, let's close in prayer. Brittany, you mind closing us? Because you coughed it.
Sorry. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for this morning just to come together and study your word, God. I just pray that you would just continue to help us to learn more about you through it, God, and we just pray that you would be with us in this class and we grow, and we pray that you'd be with each person that's not here this morning and those that are watching, God. Thank you for your love and your goodness, and we praise you for all that you do. In Jesus' name, amen.
I'm sorry.